everybody, my name is Mr. Francy and welcome back to Mr. Francy Reads. Okay, so today we are continuing on with my favourites and non-favourites for the first half of 2023, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. So usually with this video I talk about all the books that I DNF'd in the first half of 2023. That's what I would be doing for this one, but I only DNF'd 3 books in the first half of 2023 and I wanted to make this more exciting. So what I've decided to do is compile a list of all the books that I've DNF'd since the start of my channel in 2020. This may not be an exhaustive list, and if you happen to remember a book that I DNF'd that did not make it on this list, let me know in the comments section below. I think I've got them all, but you never know. So we're going to jump right in. I have split this up into 3 sections. We're going to start off with all the books that I DNF'd in 2020. Then we're going to talk all the books that I DNF'd in 2021. Then we're going to talk all the books I DNF'd in 2022. And then finally, there's 4 sections. Then we'll talk about the 3 books that I DNF'd in 2023. So a long video with lots and lots of books. So grab yourself something nice to drink or eat. Sit back, relax, and enjoy all the books you're going to see on the screen that Mr. Francy DNF'd for one reason or another. Okay, let's begin with 2020. Okay, so in 2020 I DNF'd 17 books. The very first book that I DNF'd on this channel, wow, I mean, it just brings back the memories. It's this book, Succubus Blues by RICHELLE MEAD. So the main reason that I DNF'd this book is that I wanted a fantasy. The idea of reading about a main character that's a succubus intrigued me, but the problem was most of the book revolved around the protagonist's human life, like trying to live pretending to be a human, and that just annoyed me. I was more looking for a book involving a succubus where the majority of the book shows us her doing her job, if that makes sense, and not her trying to masquerade as a human. If you have a book that you can recommend for me where we see a succubus actually doing their job and not pretending to be human, I'd love to read it, but for that reason I DNF'd. Gonna try and keep these short because, as I say, we've got a lot of books to get through. The next book that I DNF'd in 2023 was this book, 3 Dark Crowns by Kendara Blake. Okay, so the setup for this book sounded amazing. 3 queens who are sisters who are battling to be the one queen that will rule. And so, 3 queens enter into a battle. Only one will survive. It's a fantasy. My problem was the writing style. It was way too flowery. Oh my gosh. If you go back to seeing me do, I believe it was my February wrap-up for 2020, you will see that I actually quote a line from that book, and even quoting it in the video, even listening to it all these years later, the quote that I said, I'm still going, oh my gosh, no wonder I DNF'd. It's way too flowery for me. The next book that I DNF'd was this book, The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson, and I humorously blame Murphy from BookTuber channel Murphy Napier for this one. One night in summer I couldn't sleep, and so I decided to pick up a book and listen to it on audiobook that was not on my TBR, and that was The Kiss of Deception. The first chapter was absolutely fantastic. We have this woman who is destined to be married in some arranged marriage, and she goes through this really intense action-packed scene and then ends up running away. I loved that, but once she had run away, things just became really, really boring. I think I made it to the halfway mark before DNFing, but I humorously blame Murphy for it because Murphy kept bringing this book up in a lot of her videos. We'll move on. The next book that I DNF'd was this book, The Magician's Guild by Trudy Canavan. So this is another fantasy book. I read predominantly read fantasy in 2020. The problem with this one was that while magic was there, magic was portrayed as purely being evil. Not one good person had a magical ability, and I didn't like that idea. I love my fantasies. I love my magic system. So to purely portray magic as being evil by only allowing evil characters to have magic annoyed me, so I DNF'd it. The next book that I DNF'd, I gave a really big go of, and that was this book, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I read up until the first quarter mark and it bored me, so I DNF'd, but then I was convinced by friends that I worked with at the time that I need to re-pick the book up because it's amazing. It's a classic for a reason. So I did. I read until the halfway mark, and then my friends, I kid you not, I fell asleep and the book fell out of my hands and hit the floor, and the thud of it falling out of my hands woke me up and made me realize, oh my goodness, it's literally putting me to sleep to the point that it's falling from my hands onto the floor. I'm DNFing. So I gave it 2 goes. It just wasn't for me. I did end up watching the Leonardo DiCaprio film adaptation to see if it would encourage me to want to keep going back to it, but by the time I got to the end of the movie, I was actually glad that I DNF'd it. It cemented the DNF for me. The next book I DNF'd was this book, The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. This is book 1 in the, I can't even remember what it's called, but anyway, it was a very, very popular series back in the day. Look, the writing style annoyed me. From the beginning, I found myself to be incredibly confused. I think I made it through a chapter, maybe 2, and just decided to DNF. It was already popular enough. It was getting more than enough exposure. I didn't feel bad DNFing it, and I just moved on. Okay, the next book, I think it's actually called the Wheel of Time series. The next book that I DNF'd was this book, East by Edith Patel. This is a book that I was at the time thinking I might be shelving it, but ultimately it just ended up being a DNF. I didn't have any more room or time to get back to it. The reason I DNF'd it would not hold up to this day, but the reason at the time was because I wasn't used to multi-perspective books, and that book contains so many different perspectives, it was really hard for me to keep track. So I DNF'd. As I said, I planned to return to it at some point, but then at some point later on in my booktube career, I decided, no, look, I just don't have room to go back to it. So it went from being a shelve to being upgraded to becoming a DNF. Nothing wrong with the book, just too many perspectives for me to be able to keep track at that time. The next book I DNF'd was this book, The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. I received this as an ARC free from a bookstore that I was purchasing a lot of books from during COVID, during the lockdown. So they were really appreciative of my business and would just throw ARC copies of books in for me for free to show their appreciation. And this one was one of them. I picked it up, the cover intrigued me, but I don't use this word, but there's no other way around explaining why I DNF'd it. I didn't vibe with the book. I just didn't. I think I was listening to it on audiobook, if I remember correctly, and the more I went along, the more I was thinking, yeah, just something about this isn't working for me. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. I just wasn't vibing with it, so I DNF'd it. I know a lot of people love N.K. Jemisin. It just wasn't working for me. It was just a personal thing. I just, wasn't vibing with it. The next book that I DNF'd was this one, The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. Oh my goodness. I actually got halfway through this book. I got up to page 350, which is the halfway mark, which shows you it's a 700-page book. If it was a cozy, I would have finished it. That's how much of an attempt I made with this one. So I had seen this book be advertised on Murphy's channel as well, and the title intrigued me, The Shadow of What Was Lost, but honestly, it was so boring. I just kept giving it more and more of a chance, and I just kept thinking, by the time I got to halfway, I didn't know I was halfway. I was listening to the audiobook and I thought, I've got to be near the end. Let me see where I'm up to. And when I found out I was only halfway at that point, my goodness, it was very easy to DNF. It was just boring. Nothing against James Islington, but nothing was keeping my attention. So I DNF'd. The next book I DNF'd was this book, The Black Prism by Brent Weeks. Okay, so my issue with this one was that it opened up with way too much profanity. I don't know how I would deal with that these days. I am someone who is turned off by profanity, but not necessarily for the reasons that you may think. I'm not necessarily offended by profanity. I just feel that profanity can be, at times, if it's overused, a lazy way to come up with a word when you can't come up with another word to use in a book. There are so many words in this English language that authors can come up with an appropriate word if they look hard enough. But sometimes they just want to use profanity instead of trying to find something that would fit more than using profanity. And so that was happening in this book, and that annoyed me. But what was the real nail in the coffin was when the magic system was starting to be discussed. One aspect of the magic system early on in this book was to use urine, and that just did not appeal to me at all. That was the nail in the coffin. That's when I DNF'd. The next book I DNF'd was this book, Nevernight by J. Christoph. So my issue with this book was that it was extremely flowery. Yeah, like, oh my gosh, it was so hard for me to read. I don't like flowery books for both reasons. One, a flowery book just doesn't work for me. I don't want a flowery book. And some people do. Some people read a book for the writing style. I don't. I read it for the story. So if your book is overly flowery, chances are I probably will DNF it. I mean, it will take a lot for me to get through an extremely flowery book because it's just not what I want, but also because I have to work extremely hard. If you're going to give me an abundance of metaphors and similes and try and just make it extremely tough to translate because you're not speaking in straightforward English, I have to work for what I'm reading, and reading is fun for me, so it just doesn't work for me. But there was another reason why I DNF'd. There was a sexual assault that occurs at the beginning of the book, and it didn't make sense for me because it's a YA, and I don't get why it's a YA. Nevernight for me should be an adult book. It doesn't make sense that it's a YA. But I famously, in that particular monthly wrap, when I read that book and was talking about how I DNF'd it, said, clearly someone came across this book and said, oh yes, it's a YA. Because I don't get it. I still to this day don't understand why it's a YA. But anyway, it should be an adult book. But yeah, both of those reasons led me to DNF. The next book that I DNF was Sabriel by Garth Nix. This was actually recommended to me by a subscriber, and I still feel horrible about DNFing this book to this day, and it's been over 3 years since I DNF'd this book. But yeah, when y'all recommend a book to me, I want to read it because y'all are recommending me books that you love, and I want to love them with you. This particular book just did not work for me. The writing style just really did not work for me at all, so I ultimately ended up DNFing it. Good news is that that same subscriber recommended me The Forest of Silence, which is book number 1 in the Del Toro Quest series, and I did get through all of Del Toro Quest Era 1. I loved it, and I plan in 2024 to read Eras 2 and 3, so yeah. I still got to read a book recommended by that same subscriber that I loved and went on to finish the series and still want to read more. But with Sabriel, it just didn't work for me. The next one I DNF'd was Pan's Labyrinth by Guillermo del Toro and Consuelo Funke. It was a mood DNF. At the time, I just wasn't in the mood for it, so I DNF'd. Nothing at all wrong with the book. Had I read it at a different point in time, I probably would have loved it. But at the time, I was looking for something specific, and it wasn't fitting my mood. I am not a mood reader. I need you to know that. It's important for you to know I'm not a mood reader. But in that moment, just as a once-off, I was looking for something, and that something wasn't happening. So I DNF'd. It was a library book, so I returned it to the library and then since forgot about it. So that's why I haven't gone back to it. The next book I DNF'd was this book, The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This book really confused the heck out of me. I felt like I had read 16 stories in the space of 20 pages. It was just too much at once. And yeah, I've heard different reviews of people who have read the book, and it just didn't entice me to go back to it. A lot of people do love Erin Morgenstern though. I just don't. I also picked up another Erin Morgenstern that will come across soon in this video a couple of years later that I also didn't like. So I guess the author's just not for me. The next one is The Lies of Loch Lomora by Scott Lynch. Oh my goodness. I didn't think I would like this book, but picking up this book was more a matter of I kept hearing the words over and over in my head. Again, I blame Murphy Napier for this one. She loves this book, and I would just keep hearing in my head, The Lies of Loch Lomora, The Lies of Loch Lomora. So one day I just thought, okay, fine, I'm going to buy the book. And I did, and I just really didn't like it at all. Again, there was a ton of swearing. There was graphicness in the prologue as well for leavings in your bathroom. It just didn't work for me at all, so I end up DNFing. The next book I picked up was Igniting the Phoenix by Alethea Staron. Okay, I will keep this quick. The book reads like a draft or a plan, I guess, for a book. So, for example, not to directly quote, but It may say something like, Michael is walking down the street. While he's walking down the street, he sees a guy on the other side of the road. So Michael crosses the road. While he's crossing the road, there's a light on from the street light. It goes out, it goes back on, then it dims, and then he says hi. It read like a plan for a book as opposed to a book, which annoyed me because it took a lot to get this book to my house. But anyway, so I DNF'd. The next, so that was the last one I read in 2020 that I DNF'd. In 2021, I DNF'd 12 books. We'll try and get through these quicker. The first is Foul is Fair by Hannah Capin. The protagonist was holding a knife in the very first chapter, and it had so much violent imagery. It was practically knife worship in the prologue, and it threw me off. Sometimes this can work if it's needed and it's going to do something that will assist with the character or the plot of the story, but to throw it at me in the prologue, for some people, it will be a shock that will intrigue them to keep going. It had the opposite effect on me. I didn't want to keep going, so I DNF'd. Princess Ben by Catherine Gilbert Murdoch. I really was intrigued to read. I love my royal reads, but it was written in ye old English, so it was just too hard for me to read. So, the writing style. House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. A lot of people love Sarah J. Maas, or Maas, however you say it. And some people have recommended other books that Sarah J. Maas has written for me to read. Maybe I shouldn't have started with House of Earth and Blood, but I did. I got 200 pages in before DNFing because I was bored. Next up is Wicked by Gregory Maguire. I only got 86 pages in, which took me a week to get to. The interesting thing about that is I read books quickly. Depending on how long the book is, it will take me 2 or 3 days to get through. This one took me a week to get through 86 pages, which is insane. And that was because it just wasn't reeling me in at all. So after those 86, I DNF'd. The next one is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. The main character in this book begins page 1 running from someone or something for some reason that took too long to get through. I just wasn't invested. So I DNF'd. The next one is The Year the Maps Changed by Danielle Binks. Nothing was happening at all after 4 chapters. And I am serious, nothing at all. I was waiting after chapter 1 going, something will happen in chapter 2. It didn't. So, okay, something's happening in chapter 3. It didn't. So I thought, if nothing happens by the end of chapter 4, we're done. Nothing happened. I DNF'd. Moving on. Next up, My Only Sunshine by Rowan McAllister. My sister actually bought this book for me to support my LGBTIQ plus reads. I love the cover. It has cowboys on it. I was so up for a male cowboy romance, but the problem was the book was way too dry. There was so much exposition, not enough quotes, not enough character interaction that I just got to the point where I just couldn't anymore. So I DNF'd. The next one is The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart. I got this as an ARC from that same bookstore. It's a dual perspective. I liked one of the perspectives. The other one annoyed me, and the annoying one was prioritized a lot over the one that I was actually enjoying. So I got over it really quickly. The next book I DNF'd really disappointed me because I was eagerly anticipating it, and that was this book, The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. The premise sounded like a revenge plot. So basically, very quickly, the premise suggests that we are following a woman who is a scientist. She wants to know if her husband's going to cheat on her or not. So she creates a replica to test out if he will cheat on her. When we get to page 1, this has already occurred. So it's not a premise. It's more like a prequel, like previously on The Echo Wife. Here's what happened, and now let's move forward. So in page 1, what we discover is she's already created the replica. The husband did cheat on her. He's now living with her, and let's move on from there. It didn't work for me. If you're going to give me a premise, please don't falsely advertise. Nothing annoys me more. I don't read premises a lot these days, but I wanted to have, I think it was like 10 books that I was eagerly anticipating. And for that reason, I did look at those premises. If you are going to commit false advertising on a premise, I will DNF very quickly. Next up is Piranesi, or it's written as Piranesi, but I believe it's pronounced Piranesi by Susanna Clark. This is more a compendium of journal entries rather than just standard prose. And it just didn't feel like it had a plot. The journal entries just didn't work for me. So I DNF'd. I also got that as an ARC from that store. Next one is The Aeronauts Windless. Look, I picked this up because I wanted to read a book that Daniel Green had read. He's another YouTuber I like, and hadn't read anything recommended by him before. The more I stared at the cover after purchasing it, the more I thought I'm not going to like it. So I purposefully put it onto my October TBR because instead of reading horrors, I plan to read books that scare me too much to read. And I picked this one up. I got through the first chapter, realized it was going to be a nautical adventure, and I just come off a nautical adventure and realized that they aren't for me, so I DNF'd it when I found out it was headed in that direction. The next book that I read was one I was also eagerly anticipating, that Falsely Advertised, which was The Little French Bridal Shop by Jennifer Dupuis. So what we were meant to get was the townspeople planning a wedding behind the main character's back after she tries on a dress. So the main character's come home to help her ill mother, and while she's there just for fun, she goes into a bridal shop, tries on a dress. A town gossip sees her trying on the dress and goes, "Ooh, let's plan her wedding behind her back." It sounded really funny, but no, in reality what happened was the main character went into the store, tried on many dresses. The bridal shop owner asked her when the big day was. She lied and made up a date. Then she went home. If that's not enough, then she went home and called the flower shop owner who she knows and says, "I'm getting married on this day," even though she's not. "Let's plan all the flowers we need for the wedding." And I thought, no, this is not what the premise is telling me. It's not about everyone else planning something for you that you're unaware of. You're perpetuating a lie. So false advertising, and I DNF'd that one too. Let's move into 2022 then, and I DNF'd 13 books in 2022. The first was the Steel and Fire series as a whole. So, I DNF'd this series after book 2 ended with us going to the traveling/questing trope. If you've been with me long enough, you already know I don't like that. If you haven't, I don't like the traveling/questing trope where either you don't know where you're going or you don't know how you're going to get there, or both, because it results in meandering travel. That just annoys me. Because you don't know where you're going, so you're just meandering around, and it just doesn't work for me. So I loved book 1, but by the end of book 2, I knew we were going into the traveling/questing trope, so I never picked up book 3, so I DNF'd the series as a whole. I also DNF'd the Shopaholic series after book 1. The protagonist, which is by Sophie Kinsella, by the way. The protagonist, Becky, was just too ditzy for me to handle. If a ditzy character is cute or humorous in the way that they are ditzy, that is fine. But this character had a real serious issue, which was that she was racking up a lot of bills and she had a lot of debt she had to pay. So she would find ways to justify going into a store to buy something that she didn't even need, which would make her debt even greater. It was just annoying me the more I read it. Next up is A Perilous Cake Pop, which is book 3 from the Beachfront Bakery series by... I don't even remember the author's name anymore, so I apologize. But yeah, it's called A Perilous Cake Pop. Okay, so I actually loved books 1 and 2 of the Beachfront Bakery, but here's what happened. This was not an issue with the author, but an issue with what they had done with the audio narration of this series. The first 2 books was narrated by someone, the rest of the books were narrated by someone else. Usually I can deal with this, provided that the narrator has the same accent or is very close to the same accent. But the problem is, the first 2 books in this series were narrated by an American, and the rest were narrated by someone who's from England. And so it just completely threw me off, and I just couldn't. So I DNF'd that, the Beachfront Bakery series as a whole. Next up, A Crafty Crime by Erin Scott. So I just really didn't like the beginning at all, so I DNF'd it. I planned to read this in February of that year because I was doing a readathon bingo card thingy, and it didn't fit the prompt, so I held off on it, eventually got to it, and really just did not enjoy the beginning at all, so DNF'd it. Next up is Chocolate Chip Cookie Murder by Joanna Fluke. A lot of people say that they love this series to a certain point, but I didn't like book 1, and that's fine. The cheese sometimes stands alone, and I'm fine with that. I gave it a while as everyone said it's amazing, and the amazingness just never came for me, so I DNF'd. The next one is Southern Spirits by Angie Fox. Ellie, our main character, can see ghosts, and I just wasn't enjoying the characters. They actually made me feel uncomfortable. So what I'm trying to say there is I have no problem with Ellie being able to see and communicate with ghosts. In fact, if anything, that makes the plot interesting, but I had an issue with the characters. The characters themselves made me feel uncomfortable, and if you're going to make me uncomfortable, especially in a cozy, I'm going to DNF you. The next one is the other Erin Morgenstern I was talking about. It's The Night Circus. So the fourth wall is broken so many times in the first chapter. It was ridiculous. It was like reading a meditation. You are standing in a line. You are now moving forward in said line. You see a clock. The clock says this. Now you move forward again. I'm thinking, what the heck? This is a meditation, not a book. It didn't work for me. So I DNF'd it. Next up is Recursion by Blake Crouch. I loved Dark Matter so much by Blake Crouch that when I found out Blake Crouch had released something else, I couldn't wait to read it. My problem is that whilst the first book of Blake Crouch's involved a mystery, the main character is an amateur, well, it's a sci-fi, but there's a mystery within the sci-fi, and the main character is an amateur sleuth when it comes to the mystery element of the sci-fi, if that makes sense. Whereas with Recursion, we're following a detective. So I'm not someone who likes usually following detective books, and certainly didn't back then, so I DNF'd it, which annoyed me because, as I said, I did love Dark Matter. Next up was Medea by Euripides. I was forced to read this for school, and I just didn't like it at all, so I ended up just quickly reading the parts I needed to read in order to do the assessments I needed to do. It just wasn't working for me, so I DNF'd it. The next book I DNF'd I also needed for school, which was Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I actually read this back when I was in high school and didn't like it then, so I was intrigued to see what I would think now, being a more well-read reader and being an adult, and I still don't like it to this day. I understand that it is a classic and you need to keep in mind how things were back in the day, but I had a problem with it, and that is that it does not at all stand the test of time. The book is extremely racist, and I struggled big time with the racism of the book. So I DNF'd. Next up is Books Can Be Deceiving by Jen McKinley. I didn't like it overall. The overall tone just wasn't working for me. And then in chapter 3, something triggering for me personally occurred, and so I couldn't keep going. So yeah, it was just a personal thing. Something came up and I just went, no, that triggers me, so I just can't keep going. Nothing against the writer. Other people love it, but wasn't for me. Next up was Have Yourself a Merry Little Witness by Dakota Cassidy. I had read the first book in the Marshmallow Hollow series and I loved it, but the second book, the narrator decided to take a really snooty approach with the way that they were narrating the book, and the snootiness just did not work for me at all, so I DNF'd. Next up is Miracle on 34th Street by Valentine Davies. Look, I again was trying to listen on audiobook, but none of the audiobooks worked for me. Either they had too loud music where you can't hear the narration, or it was really staticky. So it was nothing at all against the book. It's just the audiobooks were not working for me at all. So I felt that I couldn't read it. So I didn't have the book because I had so many other books I wanted to read. Okay, so that brings us up to date to the beginning of 2023. In 2023, so far, I've DNF'd 3 books. The first of those was Furthermore by Tahara Murphy. It was too childish for me. Not all middle grades feel childish for me. There are some middle grades that I've given 5 stars to that my inner child absolutely appreciated, but there are some middle grades to me that feel way too childish even for me, and I just either can't get through them, or if I do, they end up getting a low rating. And with this one, the main character was just too immature for me, way too immature for me, and it just didn't work. It wasn't interesting me, it was just annoying me, so I figured I might as well DNF rather than read something I'm not enjoying. The second of the 3 I've DNF'd this year was Clockwork Princess by Cassandra Clare. The series was tough for me to get through anyway, and then something spoilery happened in the third and final book that was just too much for me. I think I discussed this in my, Infernal Devices Trilogy, completed SAS list video. So if you want to see more, check out that video. I think I went into spoilery detail over there, so you can check that out. And the final book, the most recent book that I DNF'd, was this book, Under the Never Sky by Veronica Rossi. So this is a YA dystopian. If I'm to enjoy a dystopian, the simplistic concept of the world needs to intrigue me enough to yearn for more. This one actually just confused me. After getting an hour into the book, I still didn't know what the heck was going on, and because of that, I ended up researching other dystopians that were out there, and I came across the Matched trilogy by Ali Condi. I decided to give book 1 a go and see what happens, and I loved book 1, so therefore I replaced Under the Never Sky with the Matched series and DNF'd Under the Never Sky. But those are all the books that I have listed that I have DNF'd since I started my booktube career. If I've missed any that you know of, let me know in the comments below. And if you've DNF'd any books this year, let me know that in the comment section below as well. If you can, please subscribe. It really does help my channel, and hit that notification bell, ding, and hit the all section so that you're notified each and every time I do upload a video. The favorites and non-favorites will continue, but in the meantime, then you will go with peace, blessings, and so much love. Please do be kind and love one another, and spread your sparkling energy all throughout the world. And until next time, happy reading. Bye everyone.